Even when you're being impeached, you still have to be president. I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle Now. And Bill, it struck me that several top stories regarding foreign policy in the news must be a challenge for the Trump White House when they're dealing with all these impeachment hearings and the circus that goes with that. And let me just throw out a couple of them here and just get your take on how it's not just whether President Trump knows what to do in these situations. It's what effect does the impeachment hearing process have on the credibility of a chief executive who's trying to negotiate with his counterparts in other countries? And
I can answer this entire episode by saying none. It has no effect.
Well, you just saved us about 15 minutes. Thank you very much, ladies and
gentlemen.
Very
much. Thank you for joining us.
And good news. So here are a couple of things here. Number one, there's news today that in the wake of President Trump tweeting some stuff about his upcoming North Korean meetings, the North Korean government news agency has announced that Mr. Kim is not interested in a meeting if it's just something that President Trump can brag about, and they're not coming to the table unless they can get something. They don't want to waste their time like they have in the previous meeting. The China trade deal, which looked like it was off again, and then suddenly there was hope, and now it seems like it's off again. It continues to roil. And then in Hong Kong, another China-related situation, Hong Kong violence is escalating, and there's more gunfire, there's more actual brutality. And so all of this is happening. And I'll get into one other issue, too, that I'd like to deal with separately. At a time when the president is being, besieged on a daily basis, not only from the media, but with requests for documents and subpoenas to people in his administration and former members of his administration. Bill, just as a guy, as a man, as somebody who's trying to run his business, how do you continue to do all that while it looks like half the country's trying to get you out of office?
I would imagine you do it the same way you did it when you were trying to keep your businesses running while you were also running for president, almost on a lark, really, in the beginning. Donald Trump doesn't seem to be a guy who he certainly seems to be a pretty good multitasker, let's put it that way. As far as answering your questions about the foreign policy and how they're affected by this ongoing goat rodeo, which, by the way, was an utter implosion on the part of the Democrats. I just don't see how it could have gone worse for them or better for us. But the goat rodeo going on in the House essentially has nothing to do with any of those things. I personally don't believe Donald Trump is watching the proceedings. In fact, I'd be willing to bet quite a bit of money he's not watching them. I'm certainly not watching them. I'm sure he's getting a summary, but given the way they launched with their star witness, it's not. I've never thought it was anything to worry about in terms of the actual outcome. As we've said innumerable times on this show, even if they bring the impeachment proceedings out of the House and send it to the Senate, it's never going to pass. So he's not going anywhere.
Well, Bill, he doesn't really have to be following the hearings as such. He's not necessarily following the live stream on C-SPAN or every other channel that's streaming them, but just the fact that there's almost literally nothing in the news except this. And he's a big consumer of news programs. That's got to affect him psychically a little bit. But more specifically, how do you look strong on the foreign stage when it looks like you're being so undercut at home?
Well, if it were me, I would walk up to a world leader who I have an adversarial conflict with. And if that person said to me, before we start talking, what about all this stuff going on back home about you being impeached? And I would look him in the eye and said, that's absolutely meaningless. Now let's get down to business. That's what I would do. Because it is. The intransigence of North Korea or China or the ongoing violence in Hong Kong is not anything that Donald Trump has absolute power over, whether he's being impeached or whether he's being canonized. It doesn't matter. He's still dealing with foreign countries and, the enemy gets a vote. So I don't really see that he's being impaired in any way by any of this. He certainly doesn't seem to be, as you say, emotionally kind of connected to it. He doesn't seem to be shattered by it. He doesn't even seem to be particularly angry about it, so much as just a vindication of everything that he ran on and everything that not only has he been telling the American people, but half the country's been telling him too. Namely, this whole thing is a gigantic Potemkin Village, where the media pretends to be impartial or somewhat impartial, and we pretend that this means it's more or less a fair fight. It's not.
For those who aren't old enough to know the reference, can you tell us what you mean by Potemkin Village?
Well, as I saw myself when I was a young teenager traveling down the Volga under the rule of Catherine the Great, Potemkin Village, I actually almost hesitated. I did hesitate. I almost didn't use the term because, as it turns out, the term as it's understood probably is not historically true. But a Potemkin Village was the idea that as Tsarina Catherine the Great went on a grand tour of Russia, she went down the Volga all the way down to Black Sea, I guess, in that general vicinity, and all along the way, I don't know if he was counselor, prime minister, or something, but certainly he was her head courtier. Very capable guy named Potemkin, allegedly had villages built all along the route so that as she went down the river, she would be able to see all of this construction and so on. And there was nothing behind them. They were just flats. They were just flats with maybe a sidewalk.
They were Hollywood sets. They
were Hollywood sets, yes. A Potemkin Village is something that's put on for show that has no substance whatsoever. It's simply the illusion of something. And I have read more recently that virtually all of the stuff that's been attributed to falsifying that trip turned out not to be true.
So let's deal with the substantive stuff. Let's pretend there's no impeachment hearings going on, and we look at North Korea. And North Korea, we've had a couple of meetings so far between President Trump and President Kim. We went from an administration, a chief executive referring to his counterpart as Little Rocket Man to one who now addresses him as Mr. Chairman. And yet nothing is happening as far as we can tell. The North Koreans seem to have been emboldened of late and have continued to test missiles. Meanwhile, the China trade deal seems to have, if not collapsed, it's certainly not making headway. And while the U.S. administration has to continue to prop up farmers who are being hurt by the tariff wars going on between the U.S. and China, we still don't have any sign that China is weakening on that front. Meanwhile, in Hong Kong, violence escalates as the months roll on, and the U.S. president has been silent, would probably be too kind of a term. He's been very reluctant to speak out on that issue. Not a lot of positive news on the home front of late, would you say?
Well, in 1968, it began with the Tet Offensive, where the North Vietnamese communists made an all-out effort to overrun key positions in the South in order to win a propaganda victory. It was an absolute catastrophe for the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese, but the American news paid it into basically the war's over and it's time to go home. Later that year, John F. Kennedy was assassinated, and so was Martin Luther King. There were riots in the streets of virtually every American city.
You mean Robert Kennedy?
I'm sorry. Yes, beg your pardon, Robert Kennedy. And then as the year continued, we saw there was an uprising in Czechoslovakia against communist rule, and on and on and on and on and on and on and on. So in the grand scheme of things, compared to 1968 or let's say 1863, this is not a particularly heavy news year. And I think the entire premise is, just for the sake of those of you who may be new to this, we pay Scott Ott to be this guy, okay, and ask these kind of questions. But addressing you as a member of the established mainstream media, Mr. Ott, I would say that the very fact that you're asking these questions is symptomatic of an endemic problem in news media today, and that is the sense that everything must be a crisis all the time. When you have 24-hour news coverage, you don't get to say, well, that's pretty much everything that's happening today of any real import. Tune in later. Not really much to say, I guess, really.
We won't be running the rest of the advertisements for the rest of this hour and nor garnering that in.
Precisely correct. And you won't be watching because we won't tell you that there's something that you need to know or else your children are going to burn. So I don't see anything that you mentioned as either a major setback or a reversal. What I see is you doing your job as a patriotic conservative, playing a devil's advocate liberal newspaper type guy, which is the entire premise of the show. I see you doing your job in trying to maintain a sense of fever pitch, of collapse, of excitement, of catastrophe, not just for the ratings, but because of the sense of the damage that it does, that they perceive that it does to Donald Trump. They perceive that if Donald Trump is portrayed as constantly being in crisis, constantly being overwhelmed, constantly being frazzled, on and on and on and on and on, then the American people will suddenly get tired of Donald Trump. When, in point of fact, what certainly seems to be happening, I did a live event last Thursday, and I've never, ever, ever had an audience that good. And they were that audience was that good to work with because they were so fired up and so angry over this impeachment thing that I think what is actually going on in terms of what's going to be remembered about mid-November 2019 is that this impeachment proceeding is obviously a sham. It has now collapsed so badly that I seriously doubt whether the Democrats will have enough votes to be even willing to go ahead with the impeachment proceedings. The actual, the vote anyway.
So it'll end with hearings, but no actual impeachment, no articles.
If I had to guess, I mean, they had no chance of removing him from office anyway. So the whole thing was a giant publicity stunt. And it was more than that. It was a preemptive attack on Donald Trump to get people's attentions off of Hunter Biden and Joe Biden and the Ukraine, which every single day we learn more and more about is essentially, it's the kind of spaghetti little Italian restaurant that's the legitimate business out in front. While meanwhile, the mafia dons are in the back there.
So I blame myself for sending you off in the wrong direction here for a moment. Let me reel it back in for a second and deal with the final international news item. And this one is regarding the state of Israel. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has, in answer to some questions, basically said that Israel's West Bank settlements don't violate international law. This is probably the first president to say this since Ronald Reagan. Now, according to the reports that I've heard, when Reagan referred to it, he said they're not a violation of law. They may be ill-advised, maybe a bad idea, but not a violation of international law. I'm told you, our viewers know from before that I'm listening to Nikki Haley's book right now, With All Due Respect. That's the name of the book. And she talks about the impact of the United States moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, the capital of Israel. And now we have the Secretary of State of the United States, again, breaking with international protocol, so to speak, and basically saying it's not a violation of international law for Israel to have these West Bank settlements. That seems counter to everything I previously said in the sense that the administration may be looking weak right now in Korea, China, and with regard to Hong Kong. This is a very strong thing to come out and say in the midst of this welter of news about the impeachment. You've got to wonder, is this kind of like bombing an aspirin factory?
Well, I got to tell you, first of all, I just disagree with this. With this idea that Donald Trump looks weak or Donald Trump is in a disadvantaged position or that America's adversaries now have leverage over Donald Trump that they didn't have before. I just don't buy that. It was certainly the case with Nixon. Nixon was destroyed by this because Nixon was guilty of the things that he was accused of doing. As far as the West Bank goes, I mean, my personal opinion is if you have a territory that is within the entire boundary of your nation, as the West Bank is, anyway, at least that part of the territory on this side of the river is in your country. And then the Gaza Strip, which the Israelis basically gave back to the Palestinians even after they won it through an aggressive attack against Israel and so on. It is not unreasonable to say this, and it is a blessing for the Israelis. But most importantly, I won't say most importantly, but as importantly, it's a blessing for the Palestinians, although they don't know it yet. I am continuing to write this 10-part history on the Cold War, 10-part podcast. Yeah, hour long each. And looking at the entire Cold War from its beginning to its end, you realize that one of the reasons that it continued for 42 years was because up until Ronald Reagan, nobody was willing to say or even think about what the Cold War was really about. Up until that point, it was more or less, and the same situation with Israel and Palestine, more or less kind of a side A, side B, Pepsi versus Coke, and they got some support, and we'll put some support over here. And it took Ronald Reagan to come out and say, you can't compare these two systems. There's no way to compare the two systems. One system is predicated on terror. The other system's predicated on freedom. One system shoots their own citizens going over a wall to get to our citizens. This is not an A and B thing. This is good versus evil. When an American president makes a statement like that about Israel, it is unfashionable because it has been the fashion to become morally blind.
And in this case, the Secretary of State speaking for the administration.
Yes. Thank you for clarifying that. It's become fashionable to be morally blind. Moral blindness and moral equivalency has been the coin of the realm starting in the mid-'60s with all of these left-wing radicals, and it just continues to blossom now, and to the point where with political correctness, it's got nothing to do with reasons, got nothing to do with their moral standing. So when the Trump administration, through the Secretary of Defense, says, of course, that's Israeli territory, it does two things. First of all, it heartens the Israelis, and that's important. We Americans cannot ever really comprehend the psychic burden of being a country that size, surrounded by that many enemies who are not just enemies, but they're shooting at you on a daily basis. So that's important. But more importantly, is it shows the Palestinian strategy to be a dead end. And that's what moving the embassy to Jerusalem accomplished. It was so long overdue. We have basically kept up a family divorce argument. And we haven't we're like a divorce court. And the court has been trying to decide whether to grant the divorce or not for 50 years. There's not been a decision one way or another. Each party is completely aggrieved. Each party has a long list of grievances and a long list of things that they can claim to their credit. Each party is trying to undermine the other party. But for 50 years, then no one has made a decision. And so you've got this couple that's still in the house bickering and screaming at each other. What moves like the move to Jerusalem for the embassy and the announcement, the obvious, clear announcement that the West Bank is only under discussion because of Israel's willingness to discuss it. Of course, it's Israeli territory.
Now, and I want to be careful here because the Secretary of State didn't. He's not declaring what is and isn't Israeli territory. He's just saying that it's not a violation of international law for Israel to build these West Bank settlements.
Well, the only way that could be true would be as if it was Israeli territory.
Could be a distinction without a difference.
It could be. And frankly, if I'm building my settlements in your country, I consider that to be a violation of international law. I think everybody else does too. So if you want to split hairs about this, that's fine. The guy who was responsible for the Chernobyl disaster said during the trial, "I will not admit that I'm guilty, but I cannot confirm that I'm innocent."
So, Bill, final question here. This is I almost hate to ask this question, and it's only because I do read comments on YouTube from people who see these videos. Mm-hmm. And I know that the very mention of the word Israel is going to spark a barrage of anti-Semitism like I thought had, withered away in the 1940s in Germany or been bombed out. And the president is in an unusual position in that he has a lot of supporters out there who really don't care for Israel, don't think the United States should be involved there, don't think that we should be helping them, don't think that we should ever risk anything for them. And yet he has stepped up with the embassy move, and now his Secretary of State, which an extension of the administration, has stepped up and basically said, speaking out in favor of our ally in the Middle East, Nikki Haley, as the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, on a number of occasions stood up for Israel in that body, the Security Council and the General Assembly. We're seeing a different approach from President Trump, and in particular, a kind of politically fraught one, considering how many apparent anti-Semites out there seem to think that they're on board with President Trump.
Which, first of all, goes to Donald Trump's enormous credit. Whether or not you think Israel is a problem for the United States, the fact that the man is going to sail into that headwind to the degree that it exists It's certainly a vocal group, but if you ask the majority of Republicans I've ever met, whether you're a supporter of Israel's, I would say 98% of them that I've ever talked to on the subject are ardent supporters of Israel. So this idea that the entire Republican Party or the conservative movement is filled with anti-Semites who hate Israel is in fact opposite of the case. It's the Democrats that have done so much to harm that country. But to address your question specifically, because you are absolutely right, this is not a made-up phenomenon. It is difficult for them to square the circle of Donald Trump being sent there to drain the swamp while at the same time aiding the people that they think are responsible for creating the swamp in the first place. I have no question about this in my heart whatsoever. I consider Israel to be a friend and ally of America because Israel is the only Western country in the Middle East. It is the only Western country in the Middle East. It is by far, if not the most scientifically advanced country per capita, then it is. It just is. And all of the values that we hold dear in America they're not identical to the values of the Israeli state. They're not identical to the values of the Israelis, but they are so much closer to the Israeli position than they are to the Arab position that this is just simply, it's a no-brainer for me. For people who say that the Jews are behind everything and that it's all pulled strings from behind the scenes and the Rothschilds and all the rest of it, I would simply say for people who are supposedly controlling the world, they paid a pretty high price for it. And I don't know how you square those two things, how you square world control and the near extinction of your people. It seems to me that if you're in control of the world, then only good things happen to you. Or if bad things happen to you, then you're not in control of the world. So I find the entire position untenable on its face. There have been things that Israel have done that I completely disagree with. There's one or two cases where Israel has reacted in a way that you could make a case for being an act of war if it turned out that the country was in fact an ideological enemy of the United States, but it's not. The first country to recognize the state of Israel was the Soviet Union. And they did that because they thought they could curry favor and win the Israelis over. But the Israelis immediately turned to the United States because the Israelis have the same basic values that we do. And the final thing I'll say on this is it is absolutely true that so much of the communist philosophy, so much of communist thinking, so much of the Communist Party, so much of the communist movement has a very disproportionately high amount of Jewish members in the Bolshevik regimes of the past. But that is not in itself anything other than the fact that that's what happened to those people. You know this better than I do, so I'd appreciate it if you would just wrap this up by telling me why there's a Star of David on our dollars.
I do not know the answer to that, and I don't even know if I was aware of that. Maybe, Bill, let me just explain. I don't see a lot of dollars, so I may not have noticed.
There is a 6-pointed star on American money. I'm virtually positive it's on the dollar. Let me see.
Yeah, I'll have to call in somebody.
No, I've only got a 5,000. Where is it? Is it on the back? Maybe it's on the 5. It's on the 10. I don't know. But in any event,
treasurer of the Continental Congress, I think I want to say his last name was Morris, but no, it's not Morris. I can't remember his last name. Anyway, he practically single-handedly financed us through the American Revolution.
That's right.
If it had not been for the efforts of this one treasurer, in effect, we could never have, we wouldn't have had the money essentially to continue that 7 long years of war. So
we wouldn't have gotten through the first year. Exactly. We wouldn't have gotten through the first year if a Jewish businessman had not funded the revolution with his own money. So there are historical examples on both sides in terms of whether or not that religion as a general rule has been good for America. But the whole idea is really just absurd. And I find myself being embarrassed that I even had to say a sentence like that. Judeo-Christian ethics. Christianity is direct descendant of Judaism because Jesus was a Jew. And so the entire ethical framework for Christianity which is what has set up this society of ours with its decency and its friendliness and its overall, generally compared to the rest of the world, overall moral integrity, is a large result of Christian thinking, which is a result of Jewish thinking. It's not a result of Muslim thinking, and it's not a result of communist thinking, and it's not a result of any of that stuff. It's not a result of French thinking. So to say that a country who's, whether you're religious or not, whether you're Jewish or not, those values, monotheistic God, single man and woman, monogamous marriage, that kind of thing, all of that foundation is built into Judaism, and it is what has made this country prosper. And as I said, I have many disagreements with the state of Israel. No, not many, a few. And there's much about the Jewish religion that I don't particularly agree with, but that doesn't matter. To say that this whole thing is the result of control by Jews is just plain not true. It's just not. And it's not only not true, I think it's profoundly un-American to blame anybody, I mean anybody, for our problems, because there are problems. And whatever other influences are acting on this country from the outside, from the moment of the revolution until today, and hopefully and presumably for hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of years in the future, there will be malignant forces at work that are trying to influence the United States of America. This is the price you pay for being a beacon of values like freedom and all the rest of it. And so while there are always influences of some kind or another out there, we are not beholden to them. To the degree that they cause damage in this country is not their fault, it's our fault. And this is something that we'd better just face up to and deal with. And I think most Americans have done a superb job of that. I've never seen another country in history, with the possible exception of Britain, that was as willing to own its own mistakes as the United States of America has, and then in order to move on and incorporate the lessons learned and try to get to a better future.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're grateful to the members of BillWhittle.com for making this show and about 40 shows a month possible. It's through their contributions that we're able to continue to do this. If you would like to find out more about membership at BillWhittle.com, you can just go to that website and click that Become a Member link. There's also a What is Membership link if you want to check it out. If you don't have time necessarily to watch all the videos and see our magnificent faces, you can also get the podcast version of Right Angle, our other show, and Bill Whittle Now. And you can listen to the entire archive of those two shows on your favorite podcast player. And we encourage you to do that. The website.
May I add one thing? I'm just speaking for myself here, but just speaking for myself, I much prefer to watch this show without audio than to listen to it without video.
Well, maybe we'll have to invent some new technology for that. Actually, if you just turn down your speaker.
I always do.
You can just see that, especially on the parts where the questions come out.
Yeah, and I always fast forward with the parts with the other guy, whatever his name is.
The website is undergoing virtually daily improvements, getting better all the time, and we're grateful for the feedback that we get from our members. They really have crafted this into something special. So if you'd like to find your people to join this community of conservatives who are engaged in rational dialogue and civil debate, then we invite you to come to BillWhittle.com and check it out. If you're on YouTube and watching that video there, make sure you hit that notification button and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss a thing. So for Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks for watching.